from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And today we have a very special guest, my friend Dr. Fred Craigie, who's a PhD. He has a specialty in spiritual health. And we're going to be talking today about spirituality and integrative health and how spiritual practices can really treat and heal the whole person. And you see his picture up here and you see him on Zoom. So I thank you so much for joining us during your lunchtime today. We're going to be talking really quickly, and welcome, Fred, to our wellness webinar. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're most welcome.
We are going to be talking for a few minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, about our community updates. So we have a private Facebook group that we'd love for everyone to join. If you're interested in that, you can sign up there at the link at the bottom there. It's called CIH, or Capital Integrative Health Community. We have a brain health series that Jen and I are going to be leading, a group health series in June. So we're going to be talking about anxiety, depression, cognitive decline. And we have one bonus visit, a thyroid group visit, coming up June 29th because of the high demand for that. And I think some people didn't make it to the last one. So there's some interest form in the chat box, and you can sign up there. I'd love to see you there. Liz Reese, our HeartMath health and wellness coach, is going to be leading another amazing series on de-stressing the nervous system. And we have this starting again on Wednesday from 4 to 5:15 p.m., which is May 26th, June 2nd, and June 9th. So please join us there. Love to see you there. And let's go with the next. I totally. Coming up after today, there is another talk, which we're looking forward to as well, May 27th, next at noon, which is going to be from the executive director of the Environmental Health Trust, whose name is Theodora Scarato. So I'll be on there, as well as my physician assistant, EJ, will also be on there along with Theodora, talking about that. So that's coming up next. And then we are going to turn it over to Fred and have a great conversation with him. Please participate, and anything that you'd like to kind of say about spiritual health. But I think first, Fred, you wanted to say some words about spiritual health. And again, welcome, and so much. Thank you so much for coming on, and we're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I love the idea of Thrive Thursdays, and I'm impressed with the program that you've got together. So much of medicine and healthcare historically has been oriented to a repairing approach to disease, which obviously is vitally important. But to see practices and I suppose the larger integrative medicine movement and the family medicine movement, which I'm a part of, turn attention more and more to well-being and to thriving and flourishing, and what that means and how we can support that is really cool. So good for you for being in the vanguard of that movement, Dr. Wong. I thought mostly I'm interested in having a conversation with people in the next 45 or 50 minutes. But I thought I would just say some things at the beginning by way of introduction to give you a sense of how I think about things and some of the things that are important to me, and to give you some stuff to react to. I want to say a few words about me by way of background. I want to talk with you briefly about what I mean by spirituality, why that's important. I want to describe a small number of spiritual practices that I found important in the work that I do, and then touch on some literature and a paradigm, particularly about spirituality in healthcare, for those of you who are healthcare providers who are involved in healthcare. So that will take a little while, and then I would really enjoy and appreciate your questions as you post them or ask them. For me, yes, I'm a psychologist. I practiced for years and years in a family medicine residency in Maine. I've been interested in spirituality for a long time. I published what I think is the first article on spirituality in the family medicine literature in the 1980s, mid-1980s sometime, and am the founder of what is the oldest non-sectarian symposium on spirituality and health in the United States, dating back to 1987. And have been involved in various other projects, curriculum development and writing articles, and a couple of books. One I hope, reader-friendly, accessible textbook on spirituality and healthcare, and one recent book on spiritually and psychologically informed meditations about health and thriving. And as Dr. Wong mentioned, I've been on the faculty of the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine since 2002, 2003, something like that, where I teach about spirituality and healing relationships and clinician well-being and things like that. Spirituality, what spirituality means to me. Spirituality is a word that we use a lot, and people have many different definitions of that. I can tell you how I think about that. My favorite definition of spirituality comes from Everett Koop, the former Surgeon General of the United States back in the President Reagan era. Koop is most known as being the anti-smoking czar, and those of you who may have been around in the early 80s will remember that President Reagan initially wasn't quite sure what to make of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and Dr. Koop said, "You really have to pay attention to this. We really have to work on this." But in addition to that, his own spirituality was very deeply important to him, and he was the keynote speaker at one of my symposia in the early 1990s. His definition of spirituality is the vital center of a person, that which is held sacred. And I love that because it has life, the idea of vitality, the word origin of that has to do with life and aliveness. It has depth, that which is sacred is more important than the things, as we say in Maine, that are wicked important. It's important to me to go to meetings, to try to contribute, professionally here and there. Loving my wife is sacred, and trying to be someone who sees and brings out the best in other people is something that's sacred for me. And the other thing about that definition is that it's inclusive. It is not necessarily limited to people who have a particular religious tradition and practice, although many people do. You can embrace that definition if you are not among those who have a religious tradition or a practice. And for that matter, it's not necessarily theistic. In the United States, the data are that most people believe in God, or may have a different name for a superordinate presence or energy or force. But some people don't, and spirituality in Koop's definition is equally important to those who are not theistic in perspective, because there are things that are sacred in everyone's life. Actually, let me just pause for a second here. And ask you, what do you think are the things that people identify that are on this idea of sacred? What do you think are the things that people identify?
You mean what I like the definition.
What is sacred for people?
What is sacred for people? I would say definitely their connections with others, for sure. Could be a belief in a higher power, like you said, nature, and certainly some essence of there being what kind of brings them alive. Um, it could be a passion, like they love poetry or they like dancing or something, like that's kind of their wrapped up in their identity. But something that that really brings them meaning and purpose in life, something or someone, I would say.
Lovely. I didn't mean necessarily for you personally to answer that question, although
I was answering generally. Actually, one person here, Mustafa, is saying on here, connection with God and energy. That was his contribution. Thank you, Mustafa.
I love what you're saying about connections with other people and connections with what gives your life meaning and purpose. I think that's indeed a lot of what I've found, and I want to talk more about that. Interestingly, when I talk with people about what's sacred, I consistently hear three things. My family, I said loving my wife is sacred, and that's certainly a kind of thing that I hear from people. Relationship with God or one's faith journey is something that is sacred. And the third thing that I hear that is really cool and really heartwarming, when I talk with people enough about this, the third thing that I hear is that people say, I want to make a difference, or I want my life to count for something, or I want the world to be a little better because I've been here. I want to give back to my community. You know, I practice in a somewhat rural setting in Maine, and these are not beret-wearing existentialists from the East Village. These are normal people who say this, just like any of us. And it's really heartwarming that they would say that. So that's the perspective that I have on spirituality as a framework for this conversation. We can talk more about that. Why is spirituality important? Well, there are hundreds of studies about the relationship between spirituality and health measures. In science, we often turn particularly to meta-analyses, and they are studies or journal articles that bring together conclusions from multiple numbers of studies. And the mother of all meta-analyses in spirituality and health, if any of you are interested, comes in one of the psychiatry journals from Harold Koenig, who's a psychiatrist at Duke, who published just an extraordinary meta-analysis in 2012, I think, where he looked at over 3,000 studies dating back to the 1870s, examining the relationship between spiritual and religious beliefs and practices and various health outcome measures. And what he found is that there were very significant and consistent relationships, mostly correlational relationships with what are called cross-sectional studies, where you look at X and Y in a point of time, but a growing number of intervention studies too. Very significant relationships between spiritual and religious beliefs and practices on mental health and measures like quality of life, subjective well-being, and so forth, on health behaviors, smoking, nutrition, exercise, things like that. And in many cases on physical health, both physiological measures like immune function would be an example, and larger outcomes. Like there's really very intriguing literature on spirituality and mortality or longevity, for instance. So there's very significant literature about the beneficial effect of spiritual and religious beliefs and practices. At a practical or a human level, if you think of the definition that I'm proposing to you, what is vital in your life and what is sacred in your life, it gives direction and energy to your life. And, as any of us go through the challenges that we face, the wonderful times, the blessings that we experience, as well as the hard times, the things that are puzzling, the things that, really annoy us or are difficult for us. If you are anchored in what is vital for you and what is sacred in your life, who are you? What matters to you? What do you take pride in? What do you love? What do you cherish? What kind of person do you want to be? If you're anchored in those things, then it helps with resilience and, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, it helps with thriving. So let me mention a few spiritually informed practices that have good empirical support and that I talk with people a lot about. In no particular order, they are mindfulness, the practice of being present to your experience now in a non-judgmental way, of allowing the past to be in the past and letting go of what may be happening in the future and being present to where you are now. To me, that's something that's particularly important as I work with people clinically. And like many clinicians, I take a moment before I see somebody and I just pause for 30 seconds and I just allow the things that would direct my attention elsewhere to recede, and I remind myself why I want to be present to this person. I think that that helps me to be more available to people, helps me to be more open to intuition, and it helps me to collaborate with people more in a person-centered way. Gratitude and gratefulness are good data on gratitude practices. Forgiveness seems to me to be often an important issue clinically with people, and there are good data, both individual data and some fascinating data about large-scale initiatives on forgiveness that are very important. And then, of course, there's the personal expression of forgiveness, which is self-compassion, which for any of us as human beings, and maybe just as much or perhaps more for those of us who are in healthcare, the ability to be gentle with ourselves and the ability to be kind in a world where you can't get everything right and you can't know everything and you don't make the right choice all the time and you can't be at your best all the time. To be able to be gentle with ourselves. Serenity is a practice that is widespread in this culture, particularly in the 12-step tradition. The idea of letting go of the things you can't control and being able to put your energy and your heart into the things that you can control, and seeking the wisdom to know the difference between those two things is good spiritual practice. I did a radio interview a couple of days ago and talked about acceptance as a spiritual practice. And I think that that's worth mentioning, the spiritual practice of acceptance, which does not mean, gee, this is great, or I really like this circumstance, or also doesn't mean, I'm sure that this will be a growing experience for me. It means recognizing your experience for what it is and having that be what it is, and deciding, given where I am now, how am I going to live my life? I have a colleague in Maine who's a retired surgeon who asks people, this is what life has given you. Now, what are you going to do with your life? And that's the spiritual practice of acceptance. Let's see. Non-attachment is another spiritual practice that I talk with people. It comes largely from the Buddhist tradition of, you do what you need to do, consistent with your values and what is important to you, and you let the chips fall. You are focused not on the outcomes of what you do, but on the process of being faithful to who you are. Non-attachment. So there are others as well, but that's an example of some of the spiritual practices that I talk with people about that support this idea of vitality and sacredness of life. Now, I don't want to drone on for a long time, but for those of you who are healthcare providers, let me just mention one more idea to think about, and then I will enjoy hearing your questions and comments. And that is, as I think about and as I talk about spirituality and healthcare, I talk about three arenas where this is played out. One of them is what I call the personal arena, and that is that as healthcare providers, as people who are involved in healthcare, we really need to be accountable to being spiritually well ourselves. If you are demoralized, if you're depressed, if you're preoccupied, if you're angry about something, you will not provide good healthcare. And on the other hand, if you are an imperfect human being, but that you have a commitment and you set an intention to do the best you can and to be faithful to your work as someone in the healing business, it really makes a difference, and there are data about that. The second arena is what I call the clinical arena. If spirituality has to do for any of us with what is vital and sacred in our lives and giving expression to that, then a lot of the clinical conversation consists of supporting that with patients. What matters to you? What do you care about? What kind of person do you want to be? What do you take pride in? How do you want to be living your life? How could you be dealing with the situation with a spirit for yourself of dignity and integrity. What would be the next steps with that? Where do you see yourself going for now? Those are clinical conversations that arise out of what we're talking about. Then the third arena is what I call the organizational arena. And that is that healthcare organizations have spirits or souls in the same way that people do. In the literature, actually the word soul comes up in this literature surprisingly a fair amount, but also words like organizational culture, atmosphere, tone, and so forth. And the data are that qualities of organizations and how people work together on behalf of some meaningful mission are more than just pleasant niceties. They really make a difference in terms of variables like staff recruitment, staff attention, staff retention, provider satisfaction, patient satisfaction, process variables in healthcare, how many people get A1Cs and things like that, and in some cases with financial parameters as well. So I just mentioned this, and we can talk more about it if you want, as a framework for thinking about spirituality and healthcare, that ideally all three of these arenas work together. If you have providers and healthcare staff members who have a commitment to their own well-being, to their own presence, and who have a commitment to a mission of the organization, who are able to be present to patients and support patients in their journeys, to know patients, who are you, and to support their journeys, and are part of healthcare teams and organizations that share some of those values, it can really be a remarkable thing. Okay, so we have talked about me. We've talked about how I think about spirituality, why that's important at a kind of research population level and at a personal level. We've talked about several examples of spiritual practices, and I've tossed out this framework for thinking about spirituality and healthcare. So that's what I have to say to you, and I see a number of chat comments coming up, and I'm happy to respond to what you would like to have in this conversation now.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Fred. And there's so much here to unravel or unpack this. I almost feel like this is like a birthday gift or some special gift, like unwrapping this, with a bow, because really spiritual health, when you think about it, right? I mean, what is sacred to life, what is vital to life, that's giving us direction, all the things that are basically, I think you said in your book too, it's like, what are the miracles that happen even with mundane moments, even with like very day-to-day washing my hands, or like pouring a cup of water and drinking something, what brings this meaning to our lives, both individually and collectively. And so and one of the things, just I'll start clinically for a second, and then we can go to some of the deeper topics as well. But I would say I just see time and time over again with my patients and my own personal life, spiritual wellness is really key to health. And we often, I think, conveniently or probably unconsciously forget about it in medicine because, or, we kind of overlook it a lot of times. I think in our clinic, we've kind of gotten more and more into how this is so important in health, and we focus on mental, emotional, spiritual health. But even these outcome studies, I think we know that on a visceral level, but even these outcome studies are saying that, forgiveness affects health, and, gratitude affects health. There's hundreds of studies, probably thousands of studies on this now. Let's ask one. Oh, okay. Actually, let's go with Christine's question first. Christine is asking about, she said she's interested in nature-based spiritual practices. Thoughts on this? But we'll go with that.
At the Weil Center, we talk about 7 core elements of health. And they are, now I'm accountable to remembering all 7 of these. They are sleep, exercise and movement, nutrition, resilience, relationships, spirituality, and environment. And in this environment category, the 2 sides of the coin are being careful about toxicities, there's a lot of literature. It's not my area of expertise, but it's out there about toxicities in food products, for instance. But the other side of that coin is the idea of creating sacred space for yourself.
Yeah.
And being in nature certainly is a wonderful way of doing that. There's a literature about what's called forest bathing, which I think originates in Japan, the idea of immersing oneself in an intentional way in natural settings. But even apart from specific practices, I think getting outside, instead of wolfing down your lunch in the break room at your practice, get outside and just enjoy the outside world. Just sit and observe things. Look at some birds or look at some trees or something like that.
Absolutely.
It can be really really enlivening. And for those of us who are not at a place where you can easily get outside, I think an extension of that is creating some sacred space where you are, in your office, for instance. What can you do to arrange the environment of your office to be peaceful and calming and welcoming? In my office, for instance, I have had subdued lighting, comfortable chairs, one of those little fountains that
the fountains,
dribbles water and so forth. So I think all of these things of connecting with an environment, connecting with a space that is comforting and renewing for you can be really important.
Great. Thank you. And then Mustafa asked also, would focusing on calming the mind of anger, dissatisfaction, lack of self-image, unrealistic self-generated expectations go some way to a better understanding of spirituality? Do you understand that question, or?
The answer is yes. I think that's well said. If you, let's see, let me respond to that in a couple ways. One of them is that if you look at the literature on spirituality and health, I think that there's a theme that a lot of the explanation of the beneficial effects of spiritual religious beliefs and practices have to do with calming, have to do with de-stressing and helping people to be more present and less physiologically stressed and aroused. Mm-hmm. The mind-body literature on stress is so alarming the way it does us in so many different ways. So in that sense, I think the spiritual practices that help us to be more patient, help us to be more calm, help us to be more mindful, certainly linked with spirituality, and certainly good for our health. The other thing I'll say about that is that it's interesting with difficult emotions. I think in medicine, and to some extent in psychology, we have often had the mindset that the goal is to make these feelings go away. If you're angry, to make it go away. If you're anxious, to do something to make it go away. If you're depressed, to make it go away. And in joking about this, I don't mean to minimize the suffering of people or what those experiences are like, but a different perspective would be a mindfulness perspective, which is that if you can allow those experiences to be there, but not give them the power to control your life, then that's healing. Let's see, a short example of that. I had a hallway conversation with someone in my workplace a while ago who was terrified of flying. And we talked about that, and she wanted to know what she could do to stop herself from being anxious and being terrified. And I said, well, I suppose there's some things you can work on with that. But my suggestion is just to be aware of feeling that way and allow that to be there and just
Yeah.
notice that. And, if you get to the point where it's okay to feel that way, then it will be okay. And she came back and she said, yeah, it was really interesting. I started to get anxious and I told myself, I don't have to stop this and I don't have to make it go away. I can allow that to be there. I can, look around, I can develop the ability to tolerate this. And she said, this guy really enjoyed it. And she was going to a wedding, I think. I went to the wedding and I had a great time.
Yeah.
So with emotions like that, I think the mindful perspective about facing these emotions and developing the ability to have them be there is more freeing than the quest to definitively make them go away. Because I think sometimes the harder you try to make these things go away, the bigger hole you create for yourself. The more you try to not be anxious, the more you get anxious about being anxious.
Yeah, it's like those gaming arcades where you're trying to punch the alligator, but then it like pops out again. The
That's right.
arcades.
The Bobo doll, right?
Bobo doll. Yes, yes, exactly. Jody has another question. She says, "I love the conversation. Thank you, Jody." She's loving all the 1 to 7 spiritual practices you discussed. So I did type that in the chat just for reminder for everyone. So you were saying mindfulness, gratitude, forgiveness, self-compassion, serenity, acceptance, and non-attachment, among others. Although those are not all these spiritual practices, but certainly she was asking for those who did not um, identify with a particular religion, but want to seek to grow and experience more spiritually in these ways of these spiritual practices. Do you have a recommendation on how to find a community, either locally or in general? I think locally, I mean, there's probably resources that we could try to look up through Jody in general that create social support for these practices. So certainly, all of these practices are not, you know, um, they usually don't always happen in isolation. A lot of times the social support can really keep people going with these practices too. So that's a really good point. Thank you, Jody.
Yes, and thank you as well. I think it is a good point. I think that if we have companions on the journey with these things, that supports us. Many people, do find that community and companion. As we're talking about spirituality, many people do find that community and that companionship in particularly religious settings. There are kind of non-religious organized settings. The 12-step framework, for instance, I mentioned that before in the context of serenity. For many people, 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Al-Anon, Overeaters Anonymous, 12-step programs have been really meaningful and beneficial. Support groups around particular issues, lung disease, heart disease, and so forth can be settings that can be helpful with this. But having said that, I think that you kind of create your own community. You find your own community, and it's something that can evolve as you go along. It's interesting. Often I'm asked by healthcare providers, what can I do to make spirituality more a part of my organization? And what I often say in answer to that is, get together with one other person and tell some stories about things that have touched your heart and what you do. One other person, tell some stories about that. And you will find that there is some energy in those conversations and those relationships. And it's not surprising if somebody else joins that. And eventually you'll find that there are a few people getting together to talk about these things. And the same way in the community, apart from healthcare, get together with somebody and talk about what matters to you, things that have warmed your heart, things that have touched your soul, and see how that evolves.
And that's very freeing to the soul as well, to share those stories that we have, with others. I think sharing it seems to be very freeing, when we do that, when we talk to our friends, we talk to our coworkers, talk to our neighbors. This is our community members, like you said. I agree, Fred. Creating your own community, right? Sometimes it doesn't always exist, and you have to kind of create your own community, but that can be almost one of the most effective ways for sure. And then for community resources, I mean, there probably are different websites that, we could kind of go to that. I think we could maybe research that. Maybe Christine, if you could jot that down, and we could look into that. Thank you. Peggy asked a great question. This is a great question. How do you express anger without harming relationships? I suppose that means if you're trying to express displeasure to someone, or just kind of give them feedback, maybe, hey, I'm feeling a certain way, I'm feeling angry, if that person's feeling angry, but can you do it in a way with other people without harming them? That's a good question.
Yeah, I think your comment, presupposes an answer and is consistent with what I'd say too. That I think you can't guarantee the effect on a relationship. That's the non-attachment part. You express what is important to you, and your responsibility is to do that in a honest, forthright, straightforward, respectful way. And if you do that, then it is what it is, and you hope that other people can hear that, but there's no guarantee about that. I think how we think about conflicts and how we relate to people around conflicts is important too. I have a friend who has done some fascinating meetings in Maine, where he gets together people at opposite ends of the political spectrum, people who are somewhere far out on the left, and some people who are far out somewhere on the right, and has them talk with each other, not about what are their views on things, but has them talk about how did you get to the point where you have those views? What in your life experience has brought you to the point where you have those views? And what he finds is that people go away and they say, well, I'm not sure my opinion has changed a whole lot, but I really respect people who are at a different place more than I did before.
Nice.
So there's this openness to dialogue. One of the people that I most quote in my reflections is an organizational consultant whose name is Margaret Wheatley, who says, and I think this quotation is not original with her, but she says, "You can't hate anyone whose story you know."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good premise to hold in mind as we talk with people.
I mean, it's the illusion of disconnection, right? Because the reality is both, I think, physically, we know this physically from research with heart math, with research with other type of, biological mechanisms, but on a spiritual level as well, we're all connected. So, and just physically hearing that story, that story that another person is telling us, and we're receiving that, it's going through a neural network, it's kind of getting internalized, some sort of things are happening in our brain circuits and our heart, and all these areas that have neurons, right? Our heart has neurons, our brain has neurons, our gut even has neurons. So and then that gets stored in us, and so we're not the same person we were 5 minutes before that story was told. So that's interesting. Yeah.
One of the comments that popped up I saw was one of our listeners saying, being curious instead of trying to convince or convert.
Yes.
If you extend to other people the gift of listening to them, that's really something. It is striking to me how rare in life is the experience of somebody really listening to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a gift. There was one thing that popped up there that I think is important that I want to comment on. If I can go there.
Yes.
One person said, "Gee, what do you do about injustice and the spirituality of those kinds of things?" One of the meditations in my book on the subject of hope began with a quotation from Václav Havel, the Czech journalist and activist and writer. I don't carry it in my head, but it's something to the effect of, as we advocate for things, we don't do it because there's a guaranteed prospect of success, we advocate for things because they're right. And I was really touched by that. And in the book, the example that I give is the 19th century women's movement, which began in the late 1840s with the Seneca Falls Conference, the first women's rights conference that was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, where they talked about the rights of women, and they had a declaration about that was signed by a number of women and men, including Frederick Douglass. And then for the rest of the 19th century, there were a succession of other organizations like that advocating for women's rights, and particularly for suffrage. And the thing that was striking to me about that is that all of these women who were born between the 1790s and the 1820s, none of these women, none of them lived to see the 19th Amendment. None of them lived to see the adoption of the constitutional amendment that gave women the right to vote. So for them, you know, it was a journey that the horizon was so far out there that they maybe couldn't even see the horizon.
Yeah.
But they were engaged with that. They invested their heart and their soul and their lives because it was right.
Yeah.
And I take, you know, consolation about that as I think about, you know, racial justice and economic inequality and climate change. You know, the horizon is out there somewhere, but yeah, how do you relate to that? I think the example of those 19th century women's rights people is illustrative and heartwarming.
Yeah, we're all connected in this human race, human condition, and we can't always see the finish line, wherever that is, wherever it's going to go. Maybe it's not totally predictable, like you said, but just like you said, doing what's right, what's kind of feels your soul, you know, for everyone listening here, you know, that's going to be healthy for you. Let's talk a bit about, because I know you have a couple minutes still. Let's talk about, I know some people want to talk about COVID-19 and spiritual health. How has that affected your views of spiritual health? And I guess I don't know if that's kind of a vague question, but you know, what impact has it had on I think maybe the way that you've seen or other people have asked you about, you know, COVID-19 and just, you know, just in general about that and spirit and you know, I know it's just had a major impact on, you know, mental, emotional, spiritual health, as well as of course physical health. Many people are tragically dying, you know, with COVID-19, but certainly from a spiritual end too, I feel like it's also made a big impact.
Yeah, I mentioned a couple things. One of them is what I was saying before about it's okay to have unsettling emotions as long as you don't give them the power to run the show.
Yeah.
You know, so many of us have had times during COVID where we feel, you know, depressed and anxious and angry about, you know, how things are evolving. And I think it's important to have those emotions be okay and not to get down on ourselves for feeling that way. But at the same time, you know, you still are faithful to who you are and how you want to be living your life, and you don't give those feelings the power to, you know, make you ignore your children or be, you know, unpleasant with somebody at work or something like that.
Right.
The other thing that grows out of COVID that I'm struck with is how, for many of us, I think it has really underscored the importance of relationships. Particularly early on in the first 2 or 3 months, you know, March, April, May of last year, I've lost count of how many times people will, you know, send me a note saying, "Yeah, I haven't been in touch with you for a long time. How are you doing, my friend? How are you holding up?" And you know, I you know, sent emails as well to people I hadn't been in touch with for a while. And some of these connections, you know, can continue. So I think that re-energizing of the people in our lives that we care about and we love certainly has been part of the last year for me and for many other people, and I hope will be a commitment that remains for us.
Yes, I kind of had the same experience with COVID, and of course everything's kind of topsy-turvy. We don't have everything all set in stone in terms of what's going to happen and things like that. So I started asking myself this question of, what matters, in my life. Like if everything just went away, right, like what actually matters. So I started calling up my college friends and, trying to connect with people that I haven't connected with for a long time. Really just trying to spend more time with my family, of course. So this and also just kind of like you said, trying to sit with those difficult emotions, sometimes is I have been also someone that tries to push away difficult emotions and doesn't want to deal with them. Just kind of the way that my nervous system has evolved or whatever. But I do think that uh, having some quiet time to reflect, having some space to actually, you know, just the quiet or the space, I would say, it started made me thinking about what's important in my life, and I hope for everyone listening that you've also had that opportunity as well.
Two practices I talk with people a lot about. We haven't mentioned this specifically, but two practices I talk with people a lot about are intention setting and pausing.
Okay.
Intention setting, in a sense, just as you're saying very well, you know, sitting down for a minute and thinking about, as I approach this day, as I approach this person, as I approach this meeting, as I approach what I'm about to do, may I remember who I am and what kind of person I want to be and what's important to me and how I want to be living my life, as this
Yes.
comes up. And then pausing in the sense of during the day, just taking a second to check in. How am I doing? How is it going with this remembering of what is vital and sacred in my life?
Yeah.
And looking for places during the day, walking between your office and a meeting. You can do that a little slower, and you can take a moment to pause when you're doing that. Culturally, before we eat things, there's the practice of grace. The word origin is that of gratitude and gracefulness. So looking for places to pause and to remember what is vital and sacred in our lives.
It's those sacred moments that are often the most mundane moments. I think you talk about that in your book, which is called Weekly Soul. It's on Amazon. I picked it up soon after talking with you about, coming on here, but I've started to read it. I haven't finished with it yet because I want to try to digest it and absorb those nuggets of wisdom that you've had and collated there. But yeah, I just wanted to say before I forget about that, thank you so much, Dr. Fred, for coming on. This is a really valuable topic, and something that I feel like we all know about intuitively, but we sometimes don't take the time or have the space or energy, and we can create that time and space, like you said, in your home, in your office, or wherever you are, go on nature with the Shinrin-yoku, Japanese forest bathing, or forest bathing. Do what you can to create those sacred moments in any moment of your life, essentially, right? I think that's one of the most important points I've taken from your book so far, is we don't have to wait until it's this amazing moment of spiritual health and like delving in deeply. It can be in any single moment of our lives, right? Is that right?
Indeed.
Yes. So thank
Yeah.
you so much. And I don't know if anyone else has any other questions or comments, but I just wanted to say that in our clinic, we try to live by what your advice is, and our whole clinic is a meditation on the sacred. So we are going to continue to chat with you about all that. And again, thank you so much. And we will see you very soon.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I do appreciate, as I said at the beginning, these programs and these conversations that you get together. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Jody, for the comment. She's grateful to be a part of our practice that values this topic and connects us to experts in the various fields of wellness. And yes, absolutely. And I do feel like, and this is another comment, I'll just say, the final comment is that a lot of times we focus on physical wellness, but one of my mentors is saying, and I wanted to repeat this and see what people have to say, is that physical wellness, we work on it, but then that allows us to then connect to the deeper levels of emotional, mental, and spiritual wellness. So it's all connected, it's all kind of part of the same ball of wax, so to speak. But it's definitely a big part of health, and we're going to continue to focus on that here. So thank you again. We look forward to seeing you all next week, next Thursday at 12. And everyone have a great time. Hope you enjoy your sunny weather wherever you are. and get something good to eat, and maybe take a pause or intention setting before you do that. So thank you so much. Thank you, Fred.